So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about words for a second. So I like gooey words and sticky words, and words that have ambiguous meanings, words that have multiple meanings, or words that don't really have clear meanings at all. I like words that have weird pronunciations or odd spellings, and I think creativity, well, not really with an odd spelling, it's one of these interesting and complex words, or interestingly complex words. So it's a word that I've studied for some time, and I hope that you'll be interested too in the way I've come to understand this word, the way that I've deconstructed this word, and then put it back together in some sort of way. So we'll be exploring this word today. But enough about words, let's talk about images. So I want to start with this image here. So this is an image of a large-scale public sculpture. It's called Brawley Frock, and it's by an organization called the Flux Foundation, and they're out of Oakland, California. And they're a group of artists and designers and community activists and so much more. And what they think about their work, what they call their work, they call it a form of radical collaboration. And I really like that term, and I like to think that that's some work that we can do together. It seems like there's a lot of radical collaboration happening here in Atlanta, and that's exciting to me. I kind of call that participatory creativity, so I make that transition. But I want to start with this image, which is on the cover of my book, which is over there, as we think about the whole idea of creativity. How can we think of it as a form of radical collaboration that brings together many different people with many different backgrounds, with many different talents and expertise and interests as well? So I reference this book, Participatory Creativity. It's where the thinking that comes out of my discussion with you all today comes from. So the theory for participatory creativity is outlined in this book. And I especially want to point out the subtitle of the book, Introducing Access and Equity to the Creative Classroom. So a position that I take within the field of education, within the field of progressive education, within the field of creativity and innovation in education, as our colleagues in Atlanta are studying, is that anytime we talk about creativity and education, it's especially important that we also talk about access and equity. Not many people make that jump, some people do, but I feel like if we're going to promote creativity or innovation in education, we can't lose sight of access, equity, issues of diversity, and inclusion. And that brings us to issues of racism and power and privilege. These are all connected, and I feel like they're important things to address when we talk about creativity. So a little bit about the organization that I come from. John gave you a brief overview, but Project Zero is a research center at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It was founded in 1967 by a philosopher named Nelson Goodman. And at the time, in 1967, 51 years ago, Nelson was charged with studying the cognitive affordances of the arts, what today we might call arts education or arts teaching and learning. And 51 years ago, Nelson said, well, this isn't something we really know a lot about. And he may or may not have been correct. So anyway, he called the organization, or he called the project, Project Zero. So this starting point from which we'll study the cognitive affordances of the arts. So today we know a lot more than zero about the cognitive affordances of the arts, but our scope of work has expanded as well. So some of the things we study or investigate today include different approaches to thinking and learning, what we call teaching for understanding, visible thinking or making thinking visible, global competence, digital life and learning, civic and moral education, or something I particularly focus on, which is creativity and innovation within education. So that's the work we do and the place that I come from to be with you today. So creativity, if those of you are familiar with the sort of framework for 21st century skills, you know that creativity is one of the 4 C's. So creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. And I want to hone in on one of those C's here today, and that's the whole idea of critical thinking. And I want us to bring a critical lens to the work that I'll be talking about today. And I want you to be also critical consumers of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm under the strong belief that just because somebody stands in front of you with a clicker and a lavalier microphone doesn't mean they know the best things for your kids. So bring your lens and your thinking to this work. At the same time, I want to echo a principle that one of my past professors used to say. I'm going to present a new idea today. And it's up to you if you want to buy it or not. But for the next 45 minutes, you don't have to buy it, but I'm asking you to rent it. So if you could just rent this idea, and at the end of 45 minutes, you could give it back, or after you kick the tires a few times, maybe you do want to buy it, and that would be great. But at least rent the idea with me, bring your critical lenses, and I look forward to a rich discussion with all the panelists here today, but hopefully with you all today as well. So should we jump in? Okay, all right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to push our thinking and offer you this reframing of the concept of creativity by presenting a concept that I call participatory creativity. And then I'm going to show or share with you a view from the creative classroom and show or tell the story of participatory creativity in action. And then towards the end of the discussion, I want to address some big questions and puzzles that I've heard in the past that might come to the surface for you all, but they're interesting ones I think that are important to take on. So before I get started, I want to think a little bit about the history of the word creativity. So this is a generally new word, believe it or not, that doesn't have a very long history. And we might use it very often or colloquially today, but if we look back in the past, and we don't have to go too far back in the past, we'll find that there wasn't a solid foundation for this word. So something I like to do when I give this sort of talk is I carry with me my grandmother's dictionary from 1937. So this is Grandma's dictionary. So back in the early 90s, when Grandma was sort of losing her faculties and needed to move into a special home, the family came together and helped clean out her apartment. And certain things were earmarked for certain people, and then there were some leftover things, and one of them was this dictionary. And being a younger guy back then, I said, you know what? I want that. And I've held on to it and held on to it. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I pulled it off of the shelf where I had it, where it was mostly serving a decorative purpose, and turned to the page where creativity should be, and it's not here. So a 1937 dictionary doesn't have the word creativity in it. It has the word creator and creationism, but not the word creativity. So I point that out because this is a generally new word, and we wouldn't have used it in the 1930s or even before then. And if we went even further back in time, we wouldn't have used the word for really important reasons. Just asking really quickly, does anyone know the etymological roots of the word creativity? Where the word comes from? Yes? Creare, yes. And do you know what creare means?
It means to actually create, to make.
It means to birth or beget. Creare means to birth or beget. I love it that you knew that. That was usually a rhetorical question. And then I usually get to do this punchline. I go, well, I know what it means. So I love that you knew that. Thank you so much. So creare, to birth or beget. So let's think about that. To birth or beget. Who birthed or begot things? So we wouldn't use this word. We wouldn't use it millennia ago or even 100 or 200 years ago because it was heretical. There would be only one person who was creative, and you didn't mess with him, right? So we have this very new conception of what the word creativity is, and we're applying it to individuals like ourselves in ways we would have never done before. And that transition happened through the Renaissance and the Romantic period, where people were beset with the muse and they were creative in some sort of way. But we really have to think about, well, how is this word evolving and how are we using it today? And that's some of the work that we're going to do. So I want to start by not thinking about my ideas and experiences, but coming into your ideas and experiences. So let's begin with a bit of a thought experiment. So for the next 45 seconds, I'd like you to just think quietly to yourself, not of what your definition of creativity is, because definitions are useful, but they could be abstract and lack a sense of concreteness. But I want you to think of a time where you saw creativity in action. You saw it happening, either in your experience or the experience of others. Think of a time for the next 45 seconds when you've seen creativity in action. So as you're kind of honing in on that experience and situating yourself to what that time was and who was involved, I'd like you to also think about what was creative about that experience. Why is it that moment you're recalling right now? Let's take another 45 seconds. So hopefully by now, you've thought of a moment when you saw creativity in action, and you've also thought about, well, what was creative about that experience? So for the next 3 or 4 minutes, we'll have a little bit of chaos in the room. Just share with the partner or the person sitting next to you, so, the people around you, what was that experience you brought up and what was creative about that experience? So let's have some pair share, small group discussion. About 3 or 4 minutes. Okay? Okay, so we spent some time talking about a moment when we saw creativity in action. We talked about what was creative about that experience. And if it was a moment you could see, well, then you can tell us what creativity looks like. This is a very Project Zero thing. We like to make learning visible. We like to make thinking visible. And I'd like to make creativity visible by hearing from you all what were some of those moments that you talked about. Would anyone like to share? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so you had an older brother who took black and white photographs and then hand-colored them. So he kind of hacked a traditional arts medium in some sort of way. Were they his black and white photographs or others that he'd found? Okay, so he took his own work and he kind of iterated upon it in a new and an innovative way. Great, thank you for sharing. Yes, and next to her, yeah. Okay, great. So dancing Argentine tango, but even though there are formal steps that you know, you're always improvising and responding to the music. So it's sort of a dialogue or a dance that the dancers are doing with the musicians in some sort of way. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Yes, ma'am.
A toddler that has not learned anything stands up and takes a crayon or a pencil and draws something that they've never seen. Is creativity that I've seen.
Great, excellent. So the instance was a toddler who doesn't really have formal arts training, of course, and just picks up some supplies and starts drawing things, and there they go. So I have to make a personal connection tonight. So I have a toddler. She's 15 months old, and her daycare, they draw stuff and everything. They're having a silent auction of her artwork and others tonight. So I'm gonna miss that, but. Anyway, so we can monetize that work. Okay, wonderful. Maybe one more, please. Yeah, please. Okay, so you think the serendipity is the creativity, the chance, the luck?
The serendipity is just awesome.
The serendipity is just awesome. Okay. Oh, that's interesting in itself. Analog games about technology, so kind of flipping something in some sort of way, but also the luck and the kind of serendipity as you mentioned it. So great. Thank you all for sharing. And I start with this because of a lot of reasons. I want to make connections that many of us and many of the people we know are creative or have participated in creativity in some sort of way, that we shouldn't think of creativity as this mystical thing that some people are gifted with and others are not. We can all participate in creativity in some sort of way. And indeed, all of the examples you share, they were not about, genius or greatness in some sort of way. They were about more colloquial, commonplaces ways to engage in creativity and to engage in creativity from different perspectives or from different angles. So thank you for sharing. I hope those themes kind of carry through with us as we continue our talk. So I'd like to push our thinking about surfacing a new theory of creativity. And to start, I want to talk about my friend and colleague, Vlad Glavino. And he's a very prolific creativity theorist, someone new and younger on the scene who's adding a lot of energy to it. And when Vlad, who teaches at a university in Geneva in Switzerland, when he talks about creativity theory and history, he talks about it in terms of 3 different narratives. So the first narrative that Vlad mentions is this he narrative. So this early notion of understanding creativity from a very he or dominant white male perspective, this he narrative where there are people up on high who have creativity and they're gifted with it in some sort of way that the rest of us are not. So moving through history, he then talks about an I narrative. So yeah, there's those people who are up high on the hill and they're, subscribing to the he, the very dominant white male narrative around creativity. But there's also an I narrative. And in many of the ways that you all discussed today, I can be creative too. I can do inventive things in my life. So it brings more personal agency to the individual. But it's still a very individual focus on creativity. So the next narrative that Vlad talks about is a we narrative. So moving away from individual perspectives on creativity to understanding creativity narratives that are more collective, that are more social, that involve groups of people coming together in different ways that are distributed and diverse to be creative. So these three narratives, he, I, and we. And what Vlad and many other people in the field aim to do is move beyond an understanding of creativity that is captured within the skulls and skin of people to one that is more collective and distributed. So creativity becomes more of a social activity. So I'm going to offer my definition of creativity. It's a bit heavy with a lot of jargon and big words and everything, but I think that we can tease it out over the next few minutes and come to a more commonplace understanding. So I say creativity is a distributed process of idea development that takes place over time and incorporates the contributions of a diverse network of actors, each of whom uniquely participate in the development of ideas in various ways. So the one thing I want to foreground on this slide is the word ideas. So ideas being the center of gravity that creativity revolves around. So if we're going to make ideas the center of gravity, we have to define, well, what is an idea? So I say an idea may be understood as an ever-evolving conceptual through line that is embodied through a succession of innovative products, stuff. So products range from concrete objects to utterances and speech acts. So things we make, but also things we say. And these serve as the artifacts of evolving ideas. So ideas are something that exist and change and go throughout time. And then the artifacts of those ideas, the products we make, are just markers along the way. Okay, and this is what I call participatory creativity. But to get to this place, I think we need to start with where we are and talk about how we have to think about creativity a little bit differently. So here I'm going to try to reframe creativity as a distributed and a participatory process. But I want to start with our Western kind of culture, the zeitgeist that we live within, the water that we as fish swim and breathe. So in our Western culture, we have a very individualistic approach to the world, this culture of individualism. We love our heroes, we love our valedictorians, we love our Olympic medal-winning athletes, and we love our award-winning actors and actresses. We have this very individual focus on what it means to both be creative, but also a very individual focus on what it means to achieve things. So we know that, well, I'll ask the question. When a sports team wins a national title, what's the first thing we do? Yes, we want to name who's the MVP, who's the most valuable player. So even when we know these things happen collectively, our culture drives us to say, well, who's the star? Who can we put on the pedestal? Who can we give the big ring or give the free car, or something like that? So who's the MVP? But the same thing is true. So we could say that's this really hero-oriented mentality. But the same thing is true when tragic things happen. So different from naming the MVP when things go really well, when something like let's say a terrorist attack happens, we want to know who's the mastermind behind this. Who did this? Who's the one person involved that brought it all together? So again, it's a very individualist-based focus on achievement, both generative achievement, but also really negative and maligned achievement as well. So this individual-based focus. But what we know from educational theory, and this comes from work that my colleagues and I have done at Project Zero, working with preschools in Reggio Emilia, Italy, is that most, if not all, learning happens through the interaction of groups. And then our friend, the psychologist Lev Vygotsky, teaches us that all learning is social. So if all learning is social, well, then maybe all creativity is social too. So there's a lot of theory out there in the academic world to support this idea, this social or distributed orientation towards creativity. Just throwing a couple of books up here. So the one all the way over there, that's a book called Swarm Creativity. So the collaborative advantage of innovative networks. And it's by a guy named Peter Glore, who's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, just down the road from me in Cambridge in Massachusetts. And then this book in the middle here, Group Genius. The Power of Creative Collaboration by Keith Sawyer, who's a very prolific creativity theorist. And then my friend and colleague Vlad Glavino, one of his recent books, Distributed Creativity, Thinking Outside the Box of the Creative Individual. So a lot of theory to push us beyond this individual orientation of the creator to pushing us towards a more social or distributed or collaborative or group understanding of creativity. But despite this scholarship, we still have these individual orientations towards creativity. We still think of creative icons that are geniuses, and we hold them on pedestals, and we make posters about them, sometimes with their tongues sticking out and a silly quote at the bottom, and we put them in our classroom, like, be like that guy. So creativity is an individual-based concept, we think from that perspective, and we think of people sort of like this guy. So many of you will know this is Albert Einstein, and many books have been written about Albert Einstein from the perspective of greatness, of individual achievement, of genius even. He's often heralded as a creative genius. And the tack that some of these books takes, in fact, a lot of qualitative creativity research is really rooted in biography. So telling the story of supposedly creative individuals to find out, well, what was their history? What really made those people tick in some sort of way? And what researchers are looking for there are what are the markers of creative genius so that we can support those things in other young people and bring them up in similar ways. But what we learn from all of these different biographies of creative individuals or supposedly creative individuals is that their backgrounds and their experiences, who they are, is as diverse as their work. So there's no consistent findings that we can use to support the development of genius in young people. But I don't want to throw out the idea of biography. In fact, I really like the idea of biography. It's something that I like to do, is tell the story or the history of things. But rather than tell the history or the biography of creative individuals, what I've asked is, what if we told the story, the histories, the biographies of the ideas these individuals are most known for? So in the case of Albert Einstein, rather than tell his biography, what if we told the biography of the special theory of relativity? So if we told that story, we'd find that many people have contributed to the biography of that idea. So in 1905, when Albert Einstein published his work on the theory of relativity, the special theory of relativity, at that time he was interacting with a group of people that were called the Olympiads. And it was sort of like a kind of early 20th century book club. So these guys got together and they hashed out big ideas around physics and mathematics and other things. And they really helped support his work and his ideas. Einstein was working in a particular shop at the time, a copyright patent office. And he was working with this guy, Michel Besso. And it was to Michel Besso that he actually dedicated the paper where he offered the special theory of relativity, saying that Michel helped him really develop these ideas. And of course, we know that Einstein's wife, Mileva Merrick, was a physicist herself. So all of these conversations Einstein would have been having at the time were with these other people. But he was also having more historic conversations as well. Historic conversations with people like Isaac Newton, who had this theory of fixed or specific space and time and motion. But then Michael Faraday challenged that work by studying electromagnetism and induction. And then James Maxwell further challenged that work, proving that Newton's theory did not hold. There was no fixed space and time. In fact, it was James Maxwell who first said, and I just want to get the quote right, "All our knowledge, both of time and space, is essentially relative." So the theory of relativity was actually pronounced in some sort of way, but not fleshed out in quite the same way, before Einstein came to it. And indeed, many other people contributed to the biography of this idea, and the idea goes forward into time beyond the story I've just told and the images of the people on the slide here. So thinking differently about creativity and thinking of it in terms of the biography of ideas. But we can think of a much more contemporary example than this. So I'm going to show this picture, and this isn't really where this story started, but it's a nice point to begin from. This is a picture of an apartment building in the Bronx in New York, which is where I was born. And this is 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. Does anyone know what happened at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue on August 11th, 1973? Somebody knows. Fahamu, do you know? Okay, all right, you want to tell us? Okay, this is apparently the birth of hip-hop. So it was at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue at the Bronx that this guy, this is Clive Campbell, he'd later become known as DJ Kool Herc. He was an immigrant from Jamaica, and he'd grown up with kind of dub and reggae culture, and now he was living in the Bronx in that apartment complex. And on August 11, 1973, him and his sister Cindy, this is Cindy Campbell, they threw a party. And the reason for the party was Cindy wanted new clothes for school that year. So they were like, well, let's have a big party. We'll charge people just a little bit of money. And Clive, you can handle the entertainment in some sort of way. And what he did was, he threw this party with his sister. And it's said to be kind of like the first hip-hop party. So he was spinning records. He used this sound system that he got from his dad. He had this really eclectic record collection that included all sorts of things. And what he learned was that people really liked dancing to what he called the break in a song, so when the beat kind of just keeps continuing. So he developed this technique with two turntables. He called it the merry-go-round. So you'd have the same records playing, and he'd do the break on one record, and then just as it ended, he'd do the break on the other one, and people were dancing during the break. They were break dancing. So this is a kind of concept that he developed. So this is sort of like an early genesis story of the idea of hip-hop. But many other people contributed to the idea of hip-hop. So this guy here, this guy is known as Africa Bambaataa. And around the same time, he was really involved in the gangs in New York, the gangs in the Bronx. He was a warlord for the Black Spades, which became the biggest gang in the city. But he sort of got tired of the violence associated with gangs, and he wanted people to come together as communities. So he founded an organization called the Bronx River Organization, which later became the Organization. And he said, we're an organization, we're a family, we're not a gang. And this evolved to later be called the Zulu Nation, the first hip-hop organization. And what Africa Bambaataa did, he established the 4 pillars of hip-hop: DJing and MCing, b-boying and b-girling, or breakdancing, as we might call it colloquially, and graffiti. So 4 different ways to participate in this broader idea of hip-hop. So I just want to call out one more person here, and this is a gentleman named Joseph Sadler. I don't think it's a relation to Stephen. It might be, though. So Joseph Sadler later became known as Grandmaster Flash. And he was a DJ too, but he was really into tinkering, and he was soldering and kind of working with different equipment together. And he and his colleagues invented what we would call scratching with records and things like that. And he also brought a showmanship to hip-hop that it didn't quite have before. And he worked with these 5 rappers, or what we call MCs. So they were known as Grandmaster Flash and the Fabulous 5. So really people that brought hip-hop and kind of shaped it in the early 70s. But we know that hip-hop as an idea has developed far more since then, and many people have contributed to the idea of hip-hop in a way that we know it today. So this is DJ Kool Herc, more recently at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, and his concept is, or what he likes to say, is that this isn't about geniuses or people that do this themselves. Hip-hop is a family, so everyone has got to pitch in. And I like to share this quote because I think it's a great way to think about creativity. It's not about being gifted or special in some sort of way. When we contribute to the development of creative ideas, we contribute to a broader family, a broader purpose in some sort of way. So I want to hop back in time a little bit. Talked about Grandma's notebook, Grandma's dictionary, and how in 1937 it didn't have the word creativity in it. So this is an image from World War II in the 1940s. And this is a time when we're starting to hear the word creativity enter more colloquial speech and be thought about in a more academic way. And one of the people that did that is this guy. So this is J.P. Guilford. And in the mid-20th century, J.P. Guilford was a psychometrician who worked for the U.S. Navy. So psychometrician, someone who designs psychology tests in some sort of way. And in 1950, so just after the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, but also the beginning of the cognitive revolution, the year 1950, he was elected as president of the American Psychological Association. And on his inaugural address to his colleagues, he presented a paper called Creativity. And in that paper, I know you can't all read this well, he offered this kind of challenge to his colleagues. He says, why is there so little apparent correlation between education and creative productiveness? Why do we not produce a larger number of creative geniuses than we do under supposedly enlightened modern educational practices? And then he goes on to say, these are serious questions for thought, ... And then he's going to charge his colleagues with, go out and study this stuff. So there's a couple interesting things about this quotation. The first is it kind of has resonance with our contemporary educational scenario, but different from that is that he's really focusing on the idea of genius. And we have to think about the time, the beginning of the Cold War, and we have to think about J.P. Guilford's background. He worked as a psychometrician for the U.S. Navy. And what he was interested in was finding out the best and brightest amongst us, the creative geniuses that are sitting in rows in our classrooms, and how to track them into positions where they can help us essentially beat Russia. So it was very much about tracking young people into positions where they can help support the American cause in some sort of way. So people took up Guilford's charge. One of them was this guy. So this is E. Paul Torrance, and some of you will know Torrance from his famous Torrance test for creative thinking, where he designed metrics to study creativity, especially in young people. And it was a predictive form of creativity to know who would be most creatively productive as they grew up. So this is a brick. Does anyone know why I'm holding a brick and there's a brick on the screen right now?
It balances your suitcase when you travel with that dictionary?
I like that. That was a very creative response. Other thoughts? Sir? You are such a good crowd. Yes, so this is the most popular form of creativity test. Name 50 uses for a brick. So when we ask that question, we're looking for three things. We're looking for flexibility, fluency, and elaboration. So fluency, how many different answers can you come up with? Flexibility, how different are they from one another? And elaboration, how do you elaborate on your ideas in some sort of way? And when you score a creativity test like that, creativity has right and wrong answers. Okay? So a lot of us argue, and especially myself, that this isn't really a test of creativity. We could be creative in so many different ways like those that you mentioned today that don't involve what this test measures. And essentially what we know this test measures is divergent thinking. So kind of that outside-the-box thinking that we hear so much about in rhetoric around creativity and education and innovation. But I argue that individual-based approaches to creativity and the tests that measure them are actually harmful to young people. And I'll tell you why I think that in a few different ways. So the first comes from what I call the 5 crises of creativity from the perspective of our individual-based culture. So that's sort of how I open this up. We have this individual-based approach to achievement and to creativity. So the first crisis is that some kids are more creative than others misconception. So if we have tests for creativity, and you could score more or less well on it, well then some kids are more creative than others, according to their scores on that test. And what that does, that challenges us as people who work with young people to say that, well, some young people are more creative than others, or worse, some kids are creative and other kids are not. And this unfairly puts young people into educational and career tracks that don't take full advantage of their potential. And the second crisis is related. It's the I'm just not a creative person syndrome. And many of us have heard people say that. Many of us have heard young people say that. Some of us have said that ourselves. And especially from the perspective of creativity tests and individual approaches to creativity, well, if creativity is defined in a certain way and there's a test you can take, and maybe you don't fit that description and you don't really do well on that test, well, then it makes sense that you'd say, well, I'm just not a creative person from this very specific perspective. And then relatedly, narrowly defining creativity in one way privileges some students or some young people, some adults, while it alienates others. So if you have a very specific or narrow definition for what creativity is, well, then some people are going to fit that definition, and other people are going to be outside of that definition. The fourth crisis is that these individual-based perspectives deny young people the opportunity to invent and learn and grow with others, which we know is so important from work that we've done with Reggio Emilia and in other places, but I'm sure intuitively what you know from working with young people as well. And then the fifth crisis here is that when we take these individual-based focuses, we're ill-equipping young people for life and work in the century and the decades ahead, because we don't look for geniuses anymore. We look for environments where people from different backgrounds can come together to really dig into rich problem and opportunity spaces. So the 5 crises of creativity stemming from our culture of individualism. But there's also the 3 crises of creativity that I say are stemming from our cultures of power. So this is where I bring in, well, I've been talking about the access and equity piece, but I really want to take on issues of race and power and privilege here most directly. So the first crisis here, or oh boy, I just got the 5-minute warning. The first crisis here is that assuming that creativity is socially and culturally neutral. When we think of creativity in education, we often think of it as like, oh, well, it's just creativity in education. There's nothing socially or culturally charged about it. But if we think about it, and I hope you've been noticing some of the images I've been sharing, aside from the images of the history of hip hop, creativity has actually been a conversation. Creativity research theory has mostly been a conversation amongst white people. And as those people bring their perspectives into this work and their theories form into pedagogical practices that we bring to young people, well, then we can't say that creativity is socially and culturally neutral. It's actually socially and culturally charged, and it's charged with the values of the people that have been studying and designing these experiences. The next crisis is that there's a misalignment between the identity of creative people in the classroom. So the dominant narrative, and it's certainly not the own narrative, heralds too much the work of creativity people who have been positioned as creative individuals, who are often white and male in some sort of way. I've talked about a few. Einstein, we could talk about Steve Jobs, Charles Darwin, Vincent van Gogh. So these are the people we see in the dominant narrative on the posters that herald creativity. So creativity literally doesn't look like most of our students. And then the last one here is there's an imbalance of opportunity for creativity in education that favors young people of privilege and disadvantages people from non-dominant culture. So when we put these together, 5 + 3 equals what I call the 8 barriers to access and equity in the creative classroom. And since I've got the 5-minute warning, I'm going to skip some things. So this is going to go really blurry and be really fast, but you're not seeing. Oh, wait, I could share it. No, we can't do that. Can't do that. Creativity is everywhere. It's all around us in a participatory way. How do we move beyond these individual perspectives? We put creativity in a social space by focusing not on creative individuals, but on ideas. And when we put creativity in this social space, it allows many people to contribute and participate in the development of creative ideas in some sort of way. So this is the part that I'm so sorry, but I can't share. But a quick view of creativity from the participatory classroom. Talking about this I'm going to do it. So talking about this organization in Boston. It's an after-school program, and it works with Boston Public School students. And they come together to develop ideas at the intersection of the arts and the sciences. And what they do, they work on different themes to develop innovative ideas. So there's a bunch of kids. This is Billy, Danny, and Hamza, and they come together at the Boston Art Science Prize at a time when they're studying the future of water. And they're working with Ethan and Jen. And Ethan's a scientist and Jen's an artist. And Ethan and Jen are trying to seed their ideas with certain, things they can think about. So Ethan's thinking about how water exists in nature. And think about a coconut, and a coconut carries water in some sort of way. Maybe these guys could come up with something like that. And Jen's talking about sort of rainbows and how light reflects off of raindrops in some sort of way to make that color we see in the sky. But the kids also get these seed ideas from the organization where they're prompted to think about certain things. And one of those is called a water maker. So how to bring water to people in need in different scenarios. And this connects directly to an experience Danny had on the Boston Harbor, where he was on a boat and he got stuck out at sea with a bunch of his colleagues. And even though they were surrounded by water, they didn't have any potable water to drink. So directly connecting to his experience. Danny's really hung up on this idea of bringing water to people in need. And Billy's thinking like, oh, well, maybe we could use nanotechnology to design new hair products that don't use water. Maybe. So they focus on this idea of bringing water to people in need. And they call their idea the condensator. And they're going to use condensation, but they're going to spell condensator with a K because it kind of sounds German and that kind of sounds cool. So they go with condensator. And then they start looking up this idea. And they see that there's a fog screen in Haiti that collects condensation and develops potable water. And then the military has developed something for soldiers in the desert. So they're seeing all these precedents on their idea. And they're like, they totally stole their idea. And then Ethan's like, they patented that 10 years ago. How'd they steal their idea? But young kids don't want to hear that. They're like, So they're like, So Ethan and Jen are like, it's not the end of the world. You just need to come up with something a little more innovative. So Ethan takes out a comb and he rubs it on his trousers and he holds it up to the faucet and shows them how he can bend water because of the electromagnetism. And isn't that's kind of cool? And Jen's talking about patterns and textiles and maybe that's related to polarity in water in some sort of way. And the boys are like, And then one night Ethan's at home and he's watching Mythbusters. And there's a program on Mythbusters about this Canadian scientist named Jeffrey Pike, P-Y-K-E. And Jeffrey Pike came up with a substance called pykrete, so his last name and concrete. And it was a 2080 solution of sawdust and water. When you freeze it, it's stronger than concrete, and it floats. So this was, again, during World War II. And what Jeffrey Pike wanted to do was to make aircraft carriers out of this material, right? So it floats, but it melts too. So that never happened. But what Mythbusters wanted to do was to see if pykrete, 80-20 sawdust and water solution, was really stronger than concrete. So as they do, they get some concrete, they get some pykrete, they get a shotgun, and they start shooting it, and sure enough, the pykrete is stronger than the concrete. So Ethan comes back and he says, hey guys, I watched this program on Mythbusters the other night, and there's a substance called pykrete, we can make it here in the lab, and it's bulletproof. And they're like, did you say bulletproof? That's so cool. So then they just kind of turned to make anything with pykrete. That's their idea. And then they had a snowy winter in Boston, as we do. And Jen's like, well, maybe you can make steps that go over snowbanks out of pykrete. So they basically just freeze a bunch of telephone books, and that really doesn't work out. And then they're outside shoveling one day, and one of them says, well, maybe we can make snow shovels out of pykrete. That way in the spring, when it gets warmer, they just melt. You don't have to store them in your garage. And they're like, all right, that's a cool idea. But then somebody says, you know what, it'd just be too hard to mold them. You know why they really didn't make the aircraft carriers? It'd be too hard to mold them. So they're kind of drawing on that experience. And then somebody says, let's make golf balls. They're like, golf balls? Yeah, that way when people play golf, they lose their golf balls, they'll just melt and water the grass. You don't have to worry about it. Oh yeah, okay. So they come up with all these different ways to make these pykrete golf balls. And they're thinking about it, coming up with new ideas. And then they're saying, well, we don't want to litter the golf course, so maybe we could use biodegradable materials. And they love that idea, so they call it biodegradable, right? So they're testing this out, coming up with the best biodegradable golf balls. They're sharing their idea and getting feedback from others. They're even going to the Charles River, which separates Boston from Cambridge, and shooting them in there to see how they work. And then, even testing them out with the local flora and fauna to see how they respond. And then their idea ends where they're thinking about, well, how can we make a cruise ship version so you could just knock them into the ocean and, not really feel bad about that. So, biodegradable. This is the boys, and they're working in the lab. They're using liquid nitrogen to freeze their stuff really quickly. These are some of their prototypes. So this is a real golf ball. This is like newspaper. I know that's kiwi. That's just a ball of ice. That's Doritos. So they're trying all different things. So biodegradable. So my question for you is, whose idea was it? Where did this idea come from? These are actually rhetorical questions, so you don't have to answer them. But the whole idea is that creativity is a distributed process and that all people have the opportunity to participate in some sort of way. So I've got more to share, but I know that I'm over time and I want to respect our time. We're going to take a very brief break and then come back for the panel, but I really look forward to engaging with these ideas with you all. Thank you so much for your audience, and panelists, thank you for the conversation we're about to have.